You're listening to Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan.
Welcome to Women's Media Center Live. I'm Robin Morgan. The FBI has finally announced that white supremacist groups are the greatest domestic security threat to this nation, and last week the Department of Homeland Security followed suit. So it's official, finally, after more than 30 years. I say after more than 30 years because it was in 1989 that I published the first and, regrettably, to date, the only feminist analysis of terrorism, and one of the infinitesimal few analyses by women at all. Despite the rave reviews, this was a boys' game and remains so, with the solutions being brought to you by the same folks who brought you the problem. I'm glad that I wrote The Demon Lover when I did, because if I hadn't, I would have to do so all over again right now, and besides, I've updated it 3 times since then, as it went into paperback, then in 2001 after the Twin Towers fell, and again when it became an e-book. The Demon Lover, The Roots of Terrorism, is a book about which I'm unabashedly proud, but also in an ongoing state of rage. I began it because of the explosion of multiple terrorist attacks on U.S. clinics and medical personnel who provide contraceptive and abortion services, having left 8 dead and 33 seriously wounded by the time the towers fell. There had been 20 arsons and attempted arsons, 10 bombings and attempted bombings, and clinics in 23 states had received threats of anthrax and chemical offenses, all by 2001. In the wake of September 11th attacks, the American Life League took an ad out attacking Planned Parenthood that ran in the Washington Times and declared abortion is the ultimate terrorism. Yeah. It always struck me odd that these bringers of death were so busy proclaiming the value of life, although, of course, not for the women involved. So that's where I began The Demon Lover, but that's not where I ended it, as it grew and grew to embrace violent insurgency of all kinds, an exhaustive effort. The Demon Lover is a book that covers the waterfront, with chapters showing how so-called isolated incidents form a predictable pattern, with every man's politics, the merging of patriarchy and technology, creating a democratization of violence. It covers the deadly hero of myth and the glamour attendant on the terrorist, and the way that religion, philosophy, and aesthetics all feed into the mix. It covers official terrorism, the state, and wargasm, the revolutionary high. It includes the token terrorist in a chapter along with Longing for Catastrophe, about my own experiences with this politics. There's a chapter on the Middle East and the surprise that Palestinian women presented called What Do Men Know About Life? And the book winds up with the normalization of terror and what lies beyond terror, a politics not of Thanatos, but of Eros. Women have known this truth all along, experiencing it with fear in our bodies, given domestic violence and the anti-choice movement. And so have the black and brown communities being shot down in the street or murdered in their own homes. But it took a siege of the capital of the United States to bring the war home. So today we are devoting the program to American terrorism, since the FBI and Department of Homeland Security have at last caught up with the canaries in the mine. Just who was really involved, who funded it, and how and why, who collaborated, yes, the term applies, and the kind of overhaul of all systems that any solution really demands. But before we get into any of that, we need to go inside the headlines. One policeman lost the tip of his right index finger. Others were smashed in the head with baseball bats, flagpoles, and pipes. Another lost consciousness after rioters used a metal barrier to push her downstairs and give her a concussion. The Capitol assault resulted in one of the worst days of injury for law enforcement in the United States since September 11th, 2001. At least 138 officers, and still counting, were injured. Lacerations, rib fractures, burns, even a heart attack that resulted in death. 5 people died, in fact, not counting the 2 police officers who committed suicide a few days after the insurrection. Dozens more most likely contracted the coronavirus from unmasked supporters. At least 38 Capitol Police officers have tested positive, and nearly 200 National Guard personnel deployed to protect the Capitol also tested positive. The horror of the siege, described by some as medieval because of the brutal hand-to-hand combat and the use of blunt objects like clubs and fire extinguishers as weapons, surfaced in full color at the impeachment trial of Donald Trump. That this was to no avail in persuading Republican senators to convict him was perhaps less important than that the public got to see just how vicious and lethal this battle actually was. That, too, is not counting the lingering effects on police and other law enforcement officers: concussions, irritated lungs from bear spray and tear gas, and injuries caused by repeated blows from bats, poles, and clubs. Laser pointers were aimed at eyes, causing long-term damage, and stun guns provoke PTSD for years after. One officer had 2 cracked ribs and 2 shattered spinal discs, and another was stabbed with a metal fence stake. Of the attackers charged so far, at least 11 have ties to the Proud Boys, and at least 5 ties to the Oath Keepers militia. But many of both were deliberately instructed to wear street clothes and not identify themselves as being members of paramilitary militias of the violent right. The number now arrested, but growing, stands at 230, but of the originals booked and charged at 176, they were charged in federal court, at least 22 claimed military experience. Even more alarming, more than a dozen state legislators participated in the rally and the assault on Congress, including a state representative from Missouri, a city council member from California, a state senator from Virginia, an incoming Nevada assemblywoman, and the founder of a group called Cowboys for Trump, who bragged that he had a front-row seat inside the Capitol for the blood running out of the building, close that quote, before he returned to his post as an Otero County Commissioner in southern New Mexico. Among the high-profile participants in the riot was Derek Evans, a newly elected member of the West Virginia House of Delegates, who proudly filmed himself entering the Capitol. Nor was this innocent walkthrough, as Senator Ron Johnson of Wisconsin so moronically characterized it, spontaneous. On the contrary, Ethan Nordine, so-called Sergeant-at-Arms for the Seattle Proud Boys, had issued a call on social media weeks earlier, asking for donations of protective gear and declaring, "We are in a war." Last Wednesday, the Proud Boys came under increased pressure as the Canadian government moved to formally designate them as a terrorist organization, which could lead to financial seizures and allow the police to treat any crime committed by members as terrorist activity. Joining Nordine and his followers in Washington were Nicholas Oakes, president of the group's Hawaii chapter, and Nicholas DiCarlo, a Texas man who runs a group called Murder the Media News. So many crazies, so little time. But how did they get this far, and with whose support? How did the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers militias become the Republicans' own domestic army? How did this alliance, with Trump as its cult figurehead, drive hundreds of thousands of serious Republicans out of and away from their own party, so that statistics today citing 80% of Republicans believe in QAnon theories neglect to tell you that 80% of Republicans also is less than a fraction of what the Republican Party once boasted as its membership. It's much smaller now. Well, this has been coming for a long time, possibly starting as far back as Joe McCarthy and then Nixon, or with Newt Gingrich. But perhaps a more manageable place to start would be Michigan. You remember the Michigan State House assault last April, protesting the stay-at-home order by the Democratic governor, which she ordered in order to slow the pandemic. The militias halted legislative business. They chanted, stamped, tried to force their way onto the legislation floor, and brandished rifles from the gallery. At first, Mike Shirkey, the state Senate Majority Leader, had misgivings, but he and other high-ranking Michigan Republicans came around after the planners threatened to return with more weapons and, quote, militia guys signing autographs and passing out blow-up AR-15s to the kiddies on the Capitol lawn, close quote. Shirkey even helped the cause by speaking at their next event. Trump weighed in with his Liberate Michigan tweets, and it soon became clear that Michigan's Republican Party welcomed the support of newly emboldened paramilitary groups and their brother vigilantes. 6 Trump supporters from Michigan have been arrested so far in connection with the storming of the U.S. Capitol. One, a former Marine accused of beating a Capitol police officer with a hockey stick, had previously joined armed militiamen in a protest organized by Michigan Republicans to disrupt ballot counting in Detroit. The chief organizer of that protest, Michonne Maddock, helped fill 19 buses to Washington for the January 6th surge and defended the intrusion into the Michigan Capitol. Michigan militias have a long and alarming history, going back over 25 years. Estimates of active membership statewide are generally only in the hundreds, but they constitute a dozen to 20 well-armed groups scattered across the state in mostly rural counties, their membership fluctuating with political and economic currents. The state's lenient gun laws, it's permissible to openly carry a firearm in public, also make it a welcome place for armed extremists. Members of the Proud Boys, or even of the Boogaloo movement, which calls for civil war, routinely showed up at protests in Michigan last year. Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols, who killed 168 people in the Oklahoma City bombing, had associations with and roots in militia members in Michigan. Republicans have controlled both houses of the Michigan legislature for a decade, and they held the governor's mansion for 8 years before Gretchen Whitmer took office in 2019. As for Shirkey, the Senate leader, who's known for singing hymns from the podium and was cautious at the beginning, calling the armed protest people jackasses, well, in a few brief months between April and June, a nonprofit group linked to the Republican Party began providing more than $600,000 to a new advocacy group dedicated to fighting coronavirus restraints and restrictions. A charity of Mr. Sharkey's kicked in $500,000. In the end, however, he finally declined to follow Trump, and though summoned to the White House last November, refused Trump's pleas to annul his Michigan defeat. Still, Shirkey said, he empathized with the mob that attacked the Capitol. Quote, I'm not supporting their actions, trying to have it all at once, but I understand. Close quote. The Department of Homeland Security used its National Terrorism Advisory System to warn the public about attacks by domestic groups for the first time last month, in January. Representative Benny Thompson, Democrat of Mississippi, chairing the House Homeland Security Committee, has long insisted that DHS should protect Americans from the gravest danger we face, including especially today's domestic extremists and white supremacists. Representative Michael McCall, Republican of Texas, the committee's former chair, joined lawmakers in calling for specific federal sanctions for domestic terror, potentially applying the same penalties as exist for terror originating overseas. This legislation could include penalties for providing material support to domestic groups, as well as laws holding technology companies responsible for violent and extremist content on their platforms and their programs. This would have been considerable help, for example, before January 6, when the DHS Office of Intelligence and Analysis, which collects information from the FBI as well as from private contractors and state and local law enforcement, failed to generate a specific warning about the possibility of right-wing groups storming the Capitol. What was missing was a whole-of-government approach, and an emphasis from the White House, of course. Indeed, an effort via DHS analysts in 2009 to identify white supremacists and other extremists as a growing threat fell apart amid a backlash from Republicans who viewed it in partisan terms. This had a chilling effect, which lingered for years, discouraging analysts from devoting time and resources to domestic threats. It was only in October that DHS first began to identify violent extremism in the U.S. as a severe threat in 2020, and one, they now say, which will drive an elevated threat environment at least through early 2021. The virus intensifies things, the DHS report notes, by creating an environment that could, quote, accelerate some individuals' mobilization to targeted violence, close quote. This was a description, in general terms, of the uncontained rage that motivated the Capitol attack. There is deep money behind all this, dark money, deeper than the estate of Sheldon Adelson or the coffers of Rebecca Mercer or those of the Koch brothers. There is hidden in plain sight money that keeps corrupt Republican chiefs in power at local levels, state levels, and federal, all thanks to the Supreme Court's decision on the case Citizens United. But these two gradually will surf and have begun to do so. After all, you gotta start somewhere. It's time for our first break, but don't go away because there's lots more coming up. Notoriously, just a few steps away, the Surrealism Corner. Subscribe to this program on your favorite podcast platform and leave us a review. Follow us on Twitter at WMC Live, like our Facebook page at facebook.com/WMC Live, and visit us at WMCLive.com for more information about our show and our guests.
You're listening to Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan.
If we're talking about applehood and mother pie, homegrown American terrorism, why, we must be in the Surrealism Corner. A recent NPR Ipsos poll found that a little over 1 in 3 Americans believe that a so-called deep state is out to undermine Trump. This belief is driven primarily by Republicans, what's left of the party, and Fox News viewers, though nearly half of all white men and rural residents agree as well. What's more, 37% are unsure whether the following QAnon theory is true or false, and 17% believe it to be true. This is the theory. Quote, "A group of Satan-worshipping elites who run a child sex ring are trying to control our politics and media." Close quote. Now, nearly half, 47%, believe that the majority of protests this past summer were violent, while only 38% correctly indicated that this is a false statement. Partisanship and education both play a role in belief of these events. Both Democrats and college-educated Americans answered more statements correctly than Republicans, independents, or those without a college degree. Add into this mix the overwhelming presence of COVID-19. As Susan Sontag wrote back in 1988 in her essay, AIDS and Its Metaphors, quote, "Plagues are invariably regarded as judgments on society, as a sign of moral laxity or political decline." Close quote. Somebody to blame. Indeed, in the years following the 1918 flu pandemic, areas of Germany that experienced the highest death toll saw dramatic increases in voting for the Nazi Party. Add into this now toxic mix the pressures of bankruptcy, unpaid bills, unpaid taxes, and virus-related shutdowns and job losses. Many of those arrested in the Capitol riot owned businesses or worked white-collar jobs. A Washington Post analysis found that nearly 60% of people facing charges in that insurrection had prior money troubles. And let's add in one more element, the Christian prophecy and evangelical movement. On the one hand, its failed predictions about Trump's victory has made its so-called prophets vulnerable to death threat level attacks through social media, turning on their own. But on the other hand, prophecy is a facet of fast-growing charismatic Christianity, which has an estimated 500 million with a B followers worldwide, and it's characterized by speaking in tongues and by supernatural healing. Astrology is also exploding in popularity, and more than 40% of Americans believe in psychics, according to the Pew Research Center. As an aside, small but encouraging news is that the psychics and prophets are usually competing with and even warring with one another. As another aside, larger and more depressing news is that extremist white supremacy groups, including both the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers, overlap with the Christian evangelical community. They're religious. In fact, Enrico Tarrio, the national chairman of the Proud Boys, fundraised to the tune of $113,000 from a niche Christian fundraising site that markets itself as a place to fund hope, called GiveSendGo.com. At least another $247,000 was raised for 8 members of the Proud Boys who claimed online that the money was meant for travel, medical, or legal expenses connected to the January 6th rally and siege. GiveSendGo.com has drawn criticism over its willingness to host campaigns connected to those accused of crimes, including Derek Chauvin, the former Minneapolis police officer charged in the murder of George Floyd, and Kyle Rittenhouse, the 17-year-old charged with killing 2 men and wounding a third in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Jacob Wells, chief financial officer of GiveSendGo, won't divulge the campaign owners, the major money behind the site, claiming instead it's mostly from small donations. But PayPal has announced it will no longer process transactions for the site. Wells, who claims, "I'm a Jesus guy," also claims that the site hopes to hit $1 million in revenue in 2021. It processed more than 10 million payments last year.
Enrique Tarrio exults about the $113,000 in his bank account and says he's now searching for a top lawyer to mount his many defenses. I'm going to go with the very best one I can find, he says. Last in this poisonous recipe for terrorism, in addition to the QAnon and deep state believers and the fanatic evangelist Christians, plus fundraising expertise, we can add in what police forces have tried hard and long to weed out of their ranks such extremists. Like Sheriff Chris West of Canadian County, Oklahoma, a U.S. Marine Corps veteran who spent 28 years as a highway patrolman working his way up to captain before being elected sheriff of his native county in 2017, and he then won a second term last fall, running unopposed.
Then he set his badge aside when he drove to Washington, quote, as a citizen, just an individual, to support Trump. He claims he did not participate in the storming of the Capitol, but several thousand people in his county and in rural areas to the west have signed a petition demanding his removal. Others have signed a counter-petition. He is one of at least 30 police or other law enforcement officers who attended the January 6th demonstration, who have so far been arrested on federal job charges related to breaching the Capitol. Police chiefs from the largest North American cities met in an online conference this past week, agreeing to work together to try and block members of far-right organizations and others with radical views from their ranks. Addressing domestic extremism and terrorism will hinge on the ability to curb police departments and the military, which tend to draw such people. In recent years, police or related agencies in Virginia, Florida, Nebraska, Louisiana, Michigan, and Texas have all fired officers who are members of the Ku Klux Klan. In Philadelphia in 2019, the police department announced that 13 officers would be dismissed among the 72 placed on administrative leave because of racist Facebook posts. It goes on and on. With 18,000 law enforcement agencies nationwide, many of them small and lacking resources, there's a patchwork of rules and practices for how to weed out people perceived as threats. Dismissal is not automatic. As for Sheriff West of Oklahoma, well, he didn't return calls from the New York Times seeking comment, but Sheriff David Mahoney, president of the National Sheriff's Association, said that he passed to the FBI for investigation information he had received that Sheriff Chris West of Oklahoma had made a celebratory telephone call from inside the Capitol, which, of course, isn't at all surreal. Oh, no. Time for our final break, but I'll be back directly with some fighting words. The Women's Media Center, founded in 2005 by Jane Fonda, Gloria Steinem, and myself, is a progressive, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization working to make women visible and powerful in media. You can learn more about the WMC at womensmediacenter.com.
You're listening to Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan.
Canaries in the mine can sing fighting words, if only they'll be listened to. Into which category do you put the way a woman feels when her child won't stop crying because she has nothing to feed it, even though she lives in one of the richest countries in the world. Is that economics? Normalcy? Terrorism? Questions like this helped me understand that I was going certifiably sane. Also, reading statements like these two. Violence is not the exclusive preserve of the exploiters. The exploited can use it, and what's more, should use it. And this one. There is a violence that enslaves and a violence that liberates. And thinking, well, yes, okay, all right, it's awful, but I can understand it. At least it's consistent and reasonable. And then discovering that the first is a quote from Che Guevara, and the second from Benito Mussolini. You see, words really do matter. They have consequences. Arguably as much or possibly more than Donald Trump, Mark Zuckerberg and Jack Dorsey have blood on their hands because of words. The founders, respectively, of Facebook and Twitter, one owns the other, eagerly and dutifully stepped up as the propaganda wings for the politics of terror, claiming wide-eyed innocence in being just a platform for the world community. Yet the hundreds of thousands of Rohingya Muslim villagers slaughtered in Myanmar would testify otherwise. In 1994, 500,000 Rwandans were killed in the course of 100 days. In its media case, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda in 2003 held political leaders and media accountable for the false propaganda and the promotion of ethnic hatred that led to the genocide of the Tutsi population, convicting the two founders and directors of the infamous radio station RTLM and the editor-in-chief of the newspaper Kangura for direct public incitement to commit genocide. Yes, speech has consequences. As Navi Pillay and Jessica Neuwirth wrote in Pass Blue, the Journal of Independent Coverage of the United Nations. Pillay served as president of the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda in the media trial, and subsequently as a judge on the International Criminal Court and as High Commissioner for Human Rights. Neuwirth is the Rita Hauser Director of the Human Rights Program at Roosevelt House Public Policy Institute, Hunter College. They compellingly write that the groundwork had been laid for genocide well before the death of the Rwandan president in a downed plane. If the plane was the trigger, RTLM and Kangura were the bullets waiting in the gun. In the days following, mobs rushed through Kigali, the capital, hunting down and massacring political leaders before the genocide spread to murdering ordinary citizens. Pillay and Neuwirth also argue that despite the misguided view of absolutists that the First Amendment is a blank check for incitement of violence, accountability might finally be emerging in the United States, beginning with social media and the belated actions taken by Twitter and Facebook, and even more crucially, hopefully, impending regulations. Moreover, impeachment, whatever the final result, was also some recognition that Trump bore responsibility for the attack. Recognition of the direct causal link between the mobilization of fear and anger and the fatal actions so readily taken thereafter is imperative. We have to push hard and repeatedly for such regulations and for the passage of a domestic terrorism law, which we don't have in this country and is long overdue. And we have to use legislation much ignored, but already on the books. After the Civil War, the Ku Klux Klan launched white supremacist insurrections all across the South to stop black people and their allies from voting. And 150 years ago, President Ulysses S. Grant and Congress responded to those vigilante attacks with a groundbreaking law, Known as the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871, it still protects Americans from political intimidation today. This past week, the Klan Act was cited in a federal lawsuit aimed at those involved in the January 6th attack on the Capitol, filed by House Homeland Security Chairman Benny Thompson, Democrat of Mississippi. The lawsuit accuses former President Donald Trump, his lawyer Rudolph Giuliani, and members of the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers of conspiring in violation of the Klan Act to prevent Congress from certifying Biden's victory in the 2020 election. Most of all, we have to get past the idea that there's a quick fix to this. There isn't. This fuse has been burning for a long time, and it won't be put out so easily or swiftly. Remember, there's the QAnon element, fed by Fox News and reaching nearly half of all white men and rural residents. Remember how the virus feeds into this the same way it fed into voting for the Nazi Party in 1918. Remember the Christian evangelical movement and its overlap with both anti-abortion terrorism. We were the canaries in the mine. And funding sites now for the Proud Boys. Remember the religiosity of the Oath Keepers and the rest of the extremist right. Remember the presence of police and law enforcement officials among the insurrectionists and of the U.S. military and state and other local elected officials. This will take time, education, compassion, time, severity, laws, deprogramming, time, demographics, more legislation, and time. This has nothing to do with the moronic oversimplification by the right in misblaming Antifa, or the left in chalking it all up to understandable working-class discontent. Furthermore, progressives tend to want to dismiss some of the insurrectionists as ridiculous, even funny. After all, the guy in the wolf-bear cloak, half-naked, wearing horns, the chest-beating yowls of beer-belly rioters, the sheer idiocy of people by the hundreds videoing themselves proudly for social media as they desecrated the U.S. Capitol. Yes, it is all absurd and staggeringly stupid. But we have to understand that they did not think there was anything wrong with being identified by law enforcement as intruders, didn't think there was anything wrong with what they were doing. After all, some of them were themselves law enforcement. Besides, all the official eyes were trained on the filthy foreign terrorists, weren't they? We have got to get beyond the idea that just because something is ridiculous, it's not also lethal. The emotional quotient still and always comes down to hysterical, and yes, I use the word intentionally, manhood. Hysterical manhood includes those women who identify, even at the peril of their lives, with such men. Terrorism is a politics of identity, marrying father to son, marrying patriarchy to technology. Without propaganda romanticizing the deadly hero myth, murder becomes a sordid business. But with the hero myth, any act of violence is made not only possible, but inevitable. The rapist is transformed into the seducer, the tyrant rules by divine right, the terrorist reconstitutes the hero and the patriot. This is madness. And so are acts, whether foreign or domestic, that aim to break the spirit of the opposition, which is, after all, the point of terrorism. I've thought a lot about this, breaking the spirit of the opposition. It's another form of backlash. Just now, as women grow stronger and men grow more human, it's like the tautological non-logic that explains the propaganda of violent pornography, promulgating the lie that Fear is arousing, that terror is orgasmic, that women enjoy being afraid because being afraid is women's natural state, because nice, friendly guys are on the loose in the pub and the prep school, and every time another woman dies, the rest get jumpy, which is the point of the vantage, because if women are jumpy all the time, it must mean that being afraid is their natural state, which means they enjoy it, which means give them more of the same, because fear is arousing and terror is orgasmic. This, too, is madness, as best summed up by one insurrectionist's tweet: "Live for nothing, die for something." That politics of identity is a politics of death, one that longs to pull the entire consciousness of existence down with oneself in one's own despair. Well, death is one thing. An end to birth is something else. An end to birth is what we cannot permit. We already have the power to change this. It starts now, at last. Those who would threaten existence itself with extinction should really pay attention. I'm not just mixing my metaphors when I notice that we just landed a small car with a mini helicopter attached to it on a surface almost 300 million miles away. We sent it through space and time and innumerable destructive obstacles to land it safely, snugly, and lightly on the planet Mars, as if it were a butterfly. And we remain in touch with it. It's there looking for water, and thus for signs of life. Its name is perseverance. If we can do that, we can find life here at home. Those are my fighting words. Add yours on Twitter, and remember to tag us at WMC Live and use the hashtag Fighting Words. And that's our show for this week. You can follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and now Instagram at The Robin Morgan, and you can check out my blog at robinmorgan.net and find my latest book of poems, Dark Matter, and my brand new novel, Parallax, wherever books are sold. Opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily represent the Women's Media Center. Here's the family for Women's Media Center Live. Executive producer as well as founding and sustaining sponsor, Regina K. Scully. WMC president and co-executive producer of this program, Julie Burton. I'm Robin Morgan, your producer and host. Thank you for being with us. Join us again next time on Women's Media Center Live.